Hey folks, so I'm still in the mad press that is trying to be admitted to doctoral candidacy. So I've got another short one this time, minimal editing, no frills, but a decent bit of philosophy background perhaps is required. So let's do the usual YouTube thing of liking and subscribing. So I've been thinking a lot lately about defeasibleism as a theory of knowledge. So defeasibleism is knowledge that's highly probable but not certain. And in relation to that, I've been thinking about the concept of agnosticism, which we generally take to be like a neutral position on God. Now, I want to defend in this video the right of agnosticism to exist as a separate category from atheism. I'm not going to defend agnosticism as a position because, as viewers of this channel are probably aware, I am a Platonic theist, so it's not a position I hold. That would be a position better suited for someone else. And generally, the definition of atheism we get, especially from movement atheists, is an atheist is a person who lacks a belief in God. And of course, this definition would make all agnostics atheists. Agnosticism isn't a neutrality position on God, but rather it's a claim about knowledge. So frequently you'll have these two-dimensional axes. So you've got Gnostic theists, God exists and we can know it. Agnostic theists, which I suppose is where I would be as someone being increasingly persuaded by defeasibleism. That is, God exists, but it's possible we don't know it on a certaintist definition of knowledge. Agnostic atheists, we don't believe that God exists but don't have knowledge, and Gnostic atheists, we can know that God doesn't exist. So I think this lacks of belief definition and pulling in agnosticism into the atheism label, and I think this whole 2D belief space model is philosophically problematic, and I have 7 objections to it, and then I'm going to think about ways we could make this model better. So the first objection is that this model assumes that beliefs are binary. One either believes in God or does not. Now, certain accounts of epistemology, for example, Bayesian epistemology, is founded on the idea that beliefs can take any value from 0 to 1, the same values as a probability. So it's possible under Bayesian epistemology to have a 50% belief in God's existence. But if that's the case, it's unclear how a lack of belief in God would explain that position. That seems like a position for which agnosticism is a perfectly reasonable position to hold. Now, I personally think Bayesian epistemology is bullshit, and I think that's going to be a subject for a future video. But it's certainly a position that's becoming increasingly popular in the skeptic community, especially being promoted by my nemesis, French historian Richard Carrier. But back to my own list of objections. So my second objection is that it precludes propositions which are themselves probabilistic. A belief of one, that the probability of God's existence is 50%. This is another thing that our definition of atheism can't account for, that having an agnostic position certainly would account for. And it's possible to combine that with the Bayesian belief to get the idea, well, lack of belief that God exists could mean, well, we're talking about a 0% belief that the probability that God exists is equal to 1, which any so-called agnostic theist, or I guess I would prefer the term defeasible theist, would probably agree with. So, yay, this definition has defined me into being an atheist again. But I think that's also problematic on the knowledge axis, because the knowledge axis implies certaintism, that knowledge requires that we are certain of something. And most people, being intellectually honest, don't claim certaintist knowledge with regard to really anything. And if knowledge is in fact defeasible, in other words, if knowledge can never be certain, then nobody has certaintist knowledge, and now not only is everyone an atheist again, but everybody's now an agnostic. So, objection three, and this is one that's been pretty widely debated, is that this definition of atheism includes entities that lack epistemic states at all. So, you'll sometimes hear rather cheerfully some atheists will say, babies are atheists too because they lack a belief in God. And so might puppies, and so might trees. It's possible for other people to temporarily lose the ability to have epistemic states. So, do I become an atheist when I go to sleep? Because when I go to sleep, I lack all beliefs, so I necessarily lack a belief in God. Or suppose that a minister gets into a car accident and is in a coma. Has he, in his coma state, become an atheist because he lacks a belief in God? But I think more than just the internal logic, there are certain practical objections that we can make to this kind of position. So it seems like there are no rational epistemic agents, right? No adults of sound mind that we generally think of as rational thinkers who have not heard about and have not formed an opinion on the God question. And think about it. Have you ever met somebody who, as an adult, had never heard of the idea of God or gods? I certainly haven't. And again, I was an atheist activist. So it seems to me that most epistemic agents will either have the belief that the probability of God's existence is some X, or they will have a semantic objection to the word God, but will have at least one of those positions. And similarly, you're unlikely to find atheists who are what we might call irrationally disbelieving atheists. So I believe that God is epistemically justified and it's completely reasonable to believe in God. I just don't personally believe. Like, I imagine that those are extremely rare, and it's so rare that even when I was an atheist activist, I didn't know any of them. And certainly nobody who is going to be debating atheism is going to be holding that position. So, this definition of atheism becomes problematic when it facilitates claim dodging. This is when people make a claim but deny they've made claims. How many times have we seen atheists make claims and then when they're pushed on those claims just deny them outright because definitionally atheism doesn't make claims? Of course, in practice, atheism is making claims about epistemic justification. Like, we know you don't believe in God, but usually you're saying you don't believe in God because there's no evidence. And then finally, I think we should just move on to the moral objection that plenty of self identified agnostics maintain that their position is distinct from atheism. I think these people deserve to be heard out and deserve to have the dignity of not being lumped in with people they disagree with. So it seems to me like if this line of thought seems useful to you, that there are multiple axes of theism upon which one can express one's position of belief. So one can be a semantic theist, perhaps, or a probabilistic theist, or an epistemic theist. And semantic theism isn't really terribly common anymore, but it was a position held by Epicurus. There is nothing that exists that satisfies the definition of God. And obviously, a semantic theist would hold there is something that exists which satisfies a definition for God, or their personal definition for God. So, a semantic theist and a semantic atheist could agree that Zeus exists, but differ over whether he should be called a god. And it's possible to conceive of semantic agnosticism. Perhaps we don't know what the word God means. Or perhaps we're a non cognitivist about the word God. Perhaps we think the notion of God doesn't really have a coherent meaning. If we're going to use conventional epistemology standards where we make claims about probability, then again, I think this is probably the best case for the agnostic to exist as those who have positive belief in propositions about God's existence, where let's say it's 50% plus or minus some error term we're comfortable with, and then a probabilistic theist will say, I think the probability of God's existence, I have a binary 100% belief that the probability of God is greater than our tolerance, and a probabilistic atheist would say, I have 100% belief that the probability of God is less than our tolerance. We can go back to this epistemic idea and talk about an epistemic theist as a person who thinks that God exists is epistemically justified for the average person. So a lot of people would say, well, if you think God talks to you, then you have justification for you to believe, but not others. But the question is whether or not the average person, having not received any kind of special revelation, would be justified. And the same thing with an epistemic atheist would say, oh, there's insufficient epistemic justification for the average person to believe God exists. We might imagine an epistemic agnosticism here where we're saying, oh, well, it's ambiguous in its state of justification. And if we're going to be Bayesians about epistemology, which again, yeah, but we might say, well, an epistemic theist might hold a greater than 50% belief in God's existence, while an epistemic atheist would hold a lower than 0.5% belief in God's existence, and then an agnostic might hold exactly a 50% level of confidence in the claim that God exists. And it dispenses with atheist babies and the paradox of everybody becoming agnostic or everybody becoming an atheist. And it allows those who wish to maintain their agnosticism as a separate philosophical category to do so. All right, that's everything for this week, folks.